Public Affairs Council, which is one of the major organizations in the United States that deals with the role of American Muslims in American civil society.
Right. Now this is fairly timely. A lot of things are going on right now in our country. Of course, are you one of the founders or board members of this organization?
Currently I'm a board member. I wouldn't say that I'm a founder, but I serve on the board of directors of MPAC at this time.
And how long have they been around?
MPAC has been around for about 10 years now.
About 10 years. Right. One of the things that we're really concerned about is the role of the Muslim women in this all of the controversy that's going on. And so can you tell us what you do with MPAC to try to represent the issues of Muslim women in the United States?
Well, one thing I should say about MPAC, as a Muslim organization, it includes women in all levels of the organization itself. So it makes no distinction based on gender as far as participation in the work that MPAC does or serving on the board. And that's extremely important as a model for other communities and other organizations. Most of what is done is trying to set an example of including women and not excluding women, because one of the major problems in the Muslim world is the exclusion of women from the public space and from decision making. So MPAC's philosophy and culture is completely opposite to that, which is more in line with what Islam teaches, which is that each individual has something to contribute to the betterment of society, male and female.
Help us out there. You know, one of the things that's interesting for most Americans that are non-Muslims, they don't quite understand the garb that is worn. They don't understand the significance of it. And being that we live in this high-tech workplace where everyone's supposed to wear this, you know, whatever their jeans on Friday and all that sort of thing, tell us, if you will, what your organization believes is the correct thing for most Muslim women to do when it comes to a secular society.
Well, we think women should have the right to choose how they want to dress, as long as they don't violate the laws of the land of indecent exposure. It shouldn't make any difference how a woman chooses to dress. So we support the rights of women and support women who want to wear the hijab and cover their hair, which they feel is religiously mandated. It should be no different than a woman who puts a scarf around her neck, as basically as just an accessory to her outfit.
Let's follow that up a little bit. As we know, with the recent conflict in Afghanistan, the burqa was a big concern, and of course, still to this day, I think they still wear some form of burqa in Saudi Arabia. Do they not?
It's called abaya. It has a different name, but it has the same
idea.
Yeah.
You can't see the person's face. So tell us, if you will, would you then support that sort of garb for the workplace as well?
Well, like I said, it really depends on what the rules are and what the laws are. Now, if you work someplace where someone needs to identify you and who you are, and they can't identify you because they can't see your face, like walking into your job with a ski mask, then a woman who wants to cover her face would probably be better off looking for work or something elsewhere. Most women who do that are not looking for jobs out in the mainstream. Maybe they feel more comfortable being at home and not working in the public sphere.
I was going to say that because, you know, I think everyone wants to extrapolate it out to going to the local McDonald's or 7-Eleven and having someone with a burqa behind the counter there probably wouldn't go over big.
And it's very unusual. I've never heard of a case, but I think people should not be intimidated by a woman who's wearing a scarf, dressed neatly and appropriately for her job, and simply her hair isn't showing. I don't see why that should be intimidating or offensive to anyone.
Can you help us out there too and explain what the significance of this is and why it's important for Muslim women?
In Islam, the principle of modesty is extremely important for both men and women. And the Quran itself is explicit about not drawing attention to your physical attributes. That what's more important are the other attributes of a person, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, and so forth. So there is guidance in the Quran in a general way about covering yourself in a way so that you're protected, so that when you go out, people don't harass you. There's further explanation in some of the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad about what that dress should look like, because the Quran is not as specific. And there's one saying in particular that many women and men believe in that says that the only thing that should be showing is a woman's face and her hands. And based on that and understanding of the Quran is the understanding understanding that they should be covered in that way. Now, some people also believe that, but choose not to cover because of the circumstances they're in. Maybe they are in a difficult situation, a single mother who's working and needs to be out in a place where she feels safe. Other people maybe over their life evolve to the point where they start to cover their hair. So women are at different stages and different levels of understanding. And because a woman doesn't cover her hair doesn't mean she's opposed to other women covering their hair. And just because a woman does cover her hair doesn't mean she has negative attitudes towards women who don't.
I want to cut you off there because it's important because of the state involvement in the Muslim community. When I say the state involvement, I was explaining the Taliban, for example, who made it a requirement for women to dress in a certain way. I know that's an extreme, but I guess our point is in the United States or in any of the Western countries, do you think it's I guess what I'm really trying to...
It depends on what your laws are. The laws in the United States are very liberal about what constitutes appropriate dress. There's laws and there are customs. And what's customary for one person or another is preference, personal preference, and maybe the culture at the job where your women are told you can't wear pants, you have to wear a skirt. So the women do that because that's the job and that's the rule of the job, of the marketplace. But there's still the law of the land. And once the law sets, the government sets the law as far as what dress is, what constitutes indecent exposure, whether we agree with it or not, we have to comply. Now, I am opposed to laws that force women to cover, especially in a way that makes it impossible for them to function, because Islam guarantees them the right to education, the right to work, the right to move about society, and if a woman is dressed in something that's a hazard because she can't even walk, then it violates all of her other rights.
All right, one of the things, I'm going to interrupt here because you certainly, we're going to talk more to you about than just fashion. And one of the things that's important is, what are your goals and objectives here at this conference?
I think there are several. We have several different topics we're looking at, but overall, I think the major goal is to bring the Muslim community together to learn how to become active, constructive members of society, especially at a time when our rights are being threatened. So it's really to try to promote dialogue, to promote interaction, and to promote responsibility among American Muslims.
Okay, you say that your rights are being threatened. Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, I think the most recent detentions by the INS of people from predominantly Muslim countries being arrested, and even if they were released, they still had to post up to $1,500 bail, which for many of these people imposed a great hardship. It's a form of, there's profiling that goes on for traveling and so forth that people are exposed to, and also the laws passed with the USA Patriot Act that will allow an increased degree of surveillance among certain groups without warrants and so forth.
Well, everybody's feeling that, and you don't have to be Muslim to feel the effects of the Patriot Act or the Homeland Security Act.
Well, I'm very glad to hear you say that, because many Americans don't seem to feel threatened by it other than people in our community.
I think, I guess where we're coming from here is we're trying to figure out what's the responsibility of the Muslim community now that we've had the 9/11 and we've had the Taliban experience and we have the so-called threats from Iraq and so on. Try to put that into perspective from what the Muslim point of view is here in the United States. What do you think it should be?
Well, there's different levels. One is our experience as members of the society, as American citizens, for people who are permanent residents. There's another perspective, which is who we are as individuals, as people, part of the human family in a global context. And also then finally who we are within our own religion and trying to forge our own religious identity.
Can we ask a personal question? Where were you born?
Los Angeles.
You were born in Los Angeles, so you're a naturalized.
I'm not only a citizen, I'm a native Californian.
You're a native Californian too, right? Okay.
Yeah.
And what about your parents? Where do they come from?
My father was born in the Gaza Strip, and my mother is American. She's from Missouri, from the southeast part of Missouri.
So you're a real mess like all the rest of us.
That's right. And
okay.
she has English, French, German, American Indian.
Yeah.
Perhaps more.
So what drew you to this Muslim, the Muslim women movement?
Well, I think, I care very much about Islam. Being Muslim means so much to me. I sort of had my own path to it as a young person growing up. It wasn't imposed on us at all at home. And it became something very special and close to my heart. And I learned about Islam mostly by reading the Quran and teaching myself how to pray and fasting for the first time when I was 15. And then when I started to see things being done in the name of Islam that totally contradicted everything I had learned, I felt there was a huge disconnect there. And that's been sort of the mission ever since then. So that when you see things either committed by Muslims in the name of Islam, in extremist sense, it's a battle we've been fighting for a very long time, or when you see Muslims being targeted because people assume they're extremists and have their rights stripped away by non-Muslims. So some of the activist work started when Bosnian Muslim women were being targeted for rape during the war in Bosnia, over 20,000. Other things include young women who wear the scarf in Turkey or Uzbekistan are considered symbols of extremism and militants, and therefore they are excluded from the education process. They can't get certain jobs just because of a scarf that they're wearing on their head. All of these things are part of the same milieu when it comes to Islam, but also as a human being, I do care very much about human rights for all people, not only.
Would you consider Muslim families more matriarchal in power or more patriarchal in power?
That's too broad of a question. It depends on what country they're from. If you're talking about, say, an African American family or an Egyptian American family, it really depends more on culture than it does on religion, and therefore I wouldn't answer that. I don't have enough of a sense. It depends on generation. It depends on educational level.
What about your family?
It's egalitarian.
So you think it's equal, that they're both equal under the law?
I do. My children will argue with that depending on who's setting down the
I was
rules
talking
of the
about
law.
more in response to your father and your mom.
Yeah, in my family was patriarchal because of cultural issues, not only for my father as an Arab, but for my mother as an American woman in the 1950s and 60s. We ourselves were a very patriarchal society, and I think we're just maybe moving away from that. So they both fit into that. But when I look at my relationship with my husband, it's not the same. So that's why I'm saying things change with generations. As children are born and raised in this country, I don't see it as religious. I see it as cultural.
Thank you.
Let me bring you back to Dr. Moriarty. I thank you for taking the time to do this morning. I'll take you back to the UN conference in Beijing back in 1995 when you were a speaker. And you said it served a dual purpose of dismantling stereotypes about Islam and Muslims and alleviating misapprehensions others may have about Americans. Can you tell us what you have seen over the past 7 years and how much of a setback do you think we experienced because of 9/11?
Well, I think clearly the setbacks from 9/11 in terms of stereotyping against Muslims are quite evident in terms of people having the understanding that Islam is a violent religion, and that when you look at 9/11 coupled with all of the attention the Taliban got, then you see that as really the model for how Muslim women are treated when it doesn't really reflect the reality of over 1 billion people. In the other direction, as the U.S. in response to 9/11 becomes more militaristic and unilateral in its approach, it undermines America's image in the Muslim world. What we were talking about at that time had to do with perceptions about women and women's rights and women's role in society. So where people might look at the United States as basically corrupt and over-sexualized, and people are, have unwanted pregnancies, premature sexual behavior, and so forth, and they sort of consider us just a den of sin. Our job was to say it's not like that, just like it's not, you can't generalize everywhere, and that while women in America do have problems and challenges, we have a lot of things and freedoms that we cherish. So it was very important to have that, but I do feel we've lost a lot of ground since 9/11.
One of the questions that comes up because of your heritage is the treatment of the people in Palestine. Are the Palestinians treated any worse in Israel than perhaps in other Muslim countries?
Well, I recently came back from a trip there. I went in October, and it's very important to make a distinction between Palestinians living in Israel and Palestinians living in the occupied territories. Palestinians living in the occupied territories live under occupation, live under the threat of military assault on a daily basis, and it affects every sector of society. I went on behalf of a new charity for children, and we looked at things related to health, education, water, sanitation, all kinds of things. So there is no place in the world where Palestinians are treated worse than they are in the occupied territories. In Israel proper, Palestinians are second-class citizens. If you go to a Palestinian village, or they call it an Arab village, say in the Galilee area, and then you go to a nearby Israeli village, you'll see the difference just in how the municipal services are distributed, representation in the government, supposedly a democracy, and the rights of the individuals themselves. So while people do have problems in other Arab countries, to me it's not an appropriate comparison. Israel declares itself as a democracy. It should be a democracy that provides equality to all of its inhabitants. Syria doesn't say it's a democracy. Egypt is not a true democracy. And the fact that they have human rights violations against their own people shouldn't be an excuse for Israel's violations against itself.
Can you help us out with that? One of the things is that the certain organizations in Palestine, namely Hamas. What does Hamas mean, by the way?
I think it's Islamic Resistance Movement. Islamic Resistance Movement.
And that's part of the Muslim Brotherhood also?
No, I don't think you should. It's separate in and of itself. Perhaps it had origins there historically, but it has no relationship.
At any rate, these people are blowing themselves up on the streets of Israel. And everyone wants to know why anyone would possibly want to do that. In other words, why have you? I'm sure you've given a tremendous amount of thought. Why would people want to strap plastic explosives on themselves and go into malls or wherever and blow people up? We don't. That's part of the Islamic misunderstanding or understanding. We don't know.
Well, it's a phenomenon that's very recent, and that is occurring within that whole conflict that's taking place there. And of course, it's very painful to sort of think about it and wonder why somebody would do that to himself and to other people. But once you go there, and I mean, the conditions they live under is worse than even I had imagined. And it's not an excuse to say that. You know, people suffer and have suffered through centuries, but they are engaged in an armed resistance against the occupation. And the weapons they have are guns and explosives. And so it's as if to say we've created a new weapon and it's a human bomb. That's not anything new. The kamikaze pilots during World War II, they used the same idea. It's a weapon. It's a form of attacking your enemy, and it devastated part of our naval fleet at that time, and it was not ineffective. People don't understand it because of the mentality we don't really identify with of sacrificing myself and my life knowingly for that kind of a cause. I think it's culturally different.
That's the part we don't quite understand about the Islamic religion. Really, is the fact that in most Western religions, to kill yourself either with suicide for self-suicide or suicide with others would be considered a very desperate sin.
It's not Islamic, and suicide is a sin in Islam.
So
People justify and explain it because they're so sympathetic with the Palestinians. And our position, MPAC's position, has been to say, as much as we sympathize with the Palestinians, we do not condone that action because of two reasons. Number one, suicide is prohibited in Islam. The Quran says, do not let your hands bring themselves to contribute to your own destruction. And secondly, we're opposed to the targeting of innocent civilians under any circumstances. So there is a discrepancy, and I would not attribute it to Islam. I would also say that there are many, many Christians and Jews who have died in the name of their religion and who've gone to battle knowing they were going to die. And that's been a noble and heroic action that many people don't question. Muslims do the same thing. Suicide bombing is in a different category, but the notion that people, as if it's an Islamic concept that people are willing to die for what they believe in is kind of...
No argument there. It's just that when you look at, for example, the Bali bombing, and all the people who were killed in that bombing, it shocks people. It puts them into a shock and saying that we still don't get this.
No, and what's really problematic is that it's how selective are we in our outrage against the loss of life? How outraged are people about the thousands of Chechens who've been slaughtered by the Russians? There's no outrage for that. How outraged are people by the 2,000 Palestinians who've been slaughtered by the Israelis, including numerous children? Not to mention people who've been maimed and rendered completely disabled. They don't have services for people with disabilities.
You're saying, okay, they're in very desperate situations. Why haven't the other Arab countries come to their aid financially? Whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Abu Dhabi or the Arab Emirates, why haven't they decided to say, we'll help fund these new infrastructures for the people of Palestine and support them in their effort for equal partition of that country?
They have supported on some level. They should be doing more. Why they're not, I can't say, but I can tell you that to the Palestinian people, they feel very much abandoned by their brethren around the Arab and Muslim world. So I don't know the answer to the question as to why, but it is...
Because we're saying this, if you know, if in a Christian, a secular society, if there's a problem in Ecuador, we send food and canned goods and all sorts of things down there overnight. It's all down there in Ecuador.
Right.
We're looking here in Palestine, and you say that the situation is desperate. It would seem to me with the 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, they could easily send aid to their brothers.
No, they can't, because the Israelis control the entry and exit of all goods that come into the region. So if the Israelis approve, then it will happen. If they don't, then it won't. Now they can have wire transfers of funds that can go into Palestinian banks. But if there's nothing to buy, like you can't get pharmaceuticals, because there's a certain quota of containers of shipments the Israelis, for example, will let come into Ashdod in southern Israel that goes into Gaza. If you've met the quota, they won't let any more in, whether you need it for constructing buildings, for medications for children, for hospital equipment. So as much money as you think you could pour into it, the people don't have access to the benefits of that even when they can get it.
Well, you're a brilliant woman, and I need to know this one very important question. If there was to be peace for Palestine and for Israel, is it possible under a Muslim covenant? In other words, what I'm saying to you is based on the fact that the Palestinians want the Israelis totally out, and the Israelis want to subjugate the Palestinians. Where's the peace? Will the peace ever arrive, I guess we're saying?
Well, in the short term, the only solution right now is 2 states, West Bank and Gaza. But in the long term, my vision is of a single democracy that gives all rights to all of its people, whatever covenant it's under, whatever the people choose to be governed by. I believe that people, human beings, are capable of that. It takes sacrifice, it takes a willingness to give things and give up things, but I think we can do it. And we can't do it right now, but I think that there is a potential for peace. Would have to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza. That's the only solution. What they're giving up, they have plenty of space in Israel proper. The Palestinians who lived in Israel before and were expelled in 1948, 1967 will never go back to their homes, and they know that. So for them to say, we will accept 22% of what used to be historic Palestine is a huge concession. They're not being given the moon when they're being given the West Bank and Gaza. They're being given less than a quarter of their original land.
And the last question for you, UN peacekeepers, why haven't Chairman Arafat or anyone else requested that UN peacekeepers go in there and keep peace and control that area so that they can in fact rebuild their area?
At the beginning of the Intifada in the year 2000, they did. Israel and the United States have opposed it 100% ever since, and they continue to call for it. There's several UN resolutions where there's statements in the United Nations where the Palestinian representative has called for that. We did that in East Timor. We imposed that upon the Indonesian government against their will to save the people of East Timor, predominantly Christians living in a Muslim society, and it saved them, and it saved that place, and now it's its own independent country. We did that. The international community, United States, Australia, others, we all participated in it. But in deference to Israel's wishes, we accept the refusal for peacekeepers, even though there have been numerous calls. And it's unfortunate that people, haven't been more aware of that.
Dr. Laila Al-Muradi, thank you so much for joining us on The Cutting Edge. Very kind of you.
It's been my pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Hussein Ibish. Can you tell us what brought you here to the MPAC meeting today?
They invited me.
And well, that's a good start.
I like LA and they invited me.
So tell us what were you here to do, or what are you here to do?
Well, I appeared on two panels. One was discussing threats to American democracy, war, and peace. And what I basically talked about was the way in which popular opposition and opposition within the establishment, within the government, to the war on Iraq has not done much to stop or slow, in an effective way, the drive to war. So what I was really doing was describing the way in which over the past 14 months we've ended up in this situation where war is not inevitable but imminent and very, very probable in the near future, and that the final trigger is in place. On January 27th, Hans Blix will deliver his first formal announcement or evaluation of the inspection process to the Security Council. And following the material breach declaration in response to the Iraqi weapons declaration by Secretary Powell and others, the triggers are there. The forces are being sent.
Let's do a little background on you, sir. Tell us about
that's what I was talking about.
Where did you grow up?
Well, I was born in Lebanon, and I grew up in Beirut and in traveling around different parts of Europe.
And when did you come to the States?
I moved here permanently when I was 17 in 1980.
1980.
That's correct.
Now, so you grew up in Lebanon?
More or less.
Beirut?
Yeah, in Beirut, in and out. I also spent time in various parts of Europe.
You know, everyone wants to know, there's not an American in the world that doesn't want to know what it was like growing up in Beirut during those 70s.
Well, in the late 70s, when the war first started, my family left and we went and lived in London for a while. I went back in the late 70s, and I lived in Lebanon in 1979 and 1980, and a little bit of 78. In West Beirut, in the area called Ras Beirut, the most chaotic place imaginable. And it was exciting and exhilarating and lots of fun, and also very frightening and very risky. And, I think everything about the way I look at the world was probably shaped by those experiences.
Let's ask you, because you would know of anyone would know. Tell us about some of these groups, for example, Hamas. What does Hamas mean?
Well, Hamas, it's an acronym for Islamic Resistance Movement. But Hamas is not present in Lebanon at all. And it was
Hezbollah?
Yeah, Hezbollah was, but not when I was living there. Hezbollah was formed Hezbollah means Party of God. And Hezbollah as a military political force was founded in late 1982, following the Israeli invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon and the siege of Beirut, the Sabra and Shatila massacres, all of that. The specific goal of Hezbollah as an armed force was the removal of Israeli occupation forces from South Lebanon, which was actually successfully completed from almost all areas, except for one small area called Shabab Farms, about 2.5 years ago.
Would you tell us whether Hezbollah was responsible for the bombing of the Marine barracks?
Yeah, it's an extremely interesting question. There are a number of terrorist actions like that, like the bombing of the Marine barracks, the bombing of the U.S. Embassy is another one, in 83, 84, which are usually attributed to Hezbollah. I think that there's no definitive evidence saying they did. They deny any connection. I think what is most likely is that people they had connections with, dealings with, both before and after, may have been involved in that. But I doubt that it was the organization as such, because it's not been consistent with their MO before or since. Now, I think for people in the government, people like Richard Armitage, the Undersecretary of State, and others, that's enough. That's enough to say, they're responsible and that's it. I think that in most circumstances, we don't apply that criteria of essentially what I suspect amounts to guilt by association.
Let me ask you this.
But I don't know. The truth is, I don't know, and I don't know anyone who knows for sure either. What's important and interesting is that certainly for most of its recent history over the past 10 years or so, this is not an organization that has targeted civilians except in exchanges of rocket fire with Israel, in which the Israelis have been by far the more egregious party, Most of Hezbollah's efforts in the 1990s were directed against Israeli military soldiers in Lebanon, and were therefore not only legitimate, but were pursuant to UN Security Council Resolution 425, which ordered Israel to withdraw from South Lebanon in 1978,
Right.
and was never enforced by the international community.
One of the questions, though, that everyone wants to know today,
Right.
is there a stable government in Lebanon?
There is right now certain stability and a government whose writ runs in most of the country. However, I would argue, and many people agree with this, that the basic problems, internal contradictions that led to the war that went from 75 to 1990, the Civil War, have not been solved. And that the potential for future conflict is very much still there, especially since external parties, particularly Israel and Syria, could still use Lebanon once again as a proxy battlefield in their own struggles. The other thing to be said about the Lebanese government is that while it is fairly stable and enjoys quite a bit of credibility in the country, it proceeds under a very strong Syrian hegemony. Lebanon does not, in effect, have an independent foreign or defense policy. It follows Damascus's lead. And so, in fact, Lebanon's independence is to some extent compromised.
So they've been basically subjugated by.
I don't think that's the right word at all. I think the Syrian presence, which was probably unavoidable and has actually been instrumental in stopping the war. It's been the only force that stopped the war. The war stopped in 1990 when, as part of the build-up to the Persian Gulf War, which Syria participated in on the American side, Syria was given a free hand to extend its rule throughout all of Lebanon, or its hegemony throughout all of Lebanon.
So
Rule is the wrong word.
Let's just follow this up with
Yeah.
this one, because we're on the subject of Lebanon right
Right.
now, and I think it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Was there a purging of the Christian members of the community of Lebanon?
No, not at all. That's absurd.
So the percentage
no,
of Christians that were there prior to and now.
Oh no, there probably has been a lessening, but that's partly because of births. And I think that I think a lot of Lebanese have moved. A lot of well-to-do Lebanese have moved. A lot of well-to-do Lebanese are Christians. So there probably has been a reduction, both in terms of the fact that the Shiite population in the south has the largest birth rate, larger than the Sunni Muslim population, larger than the various Christian groups. But it's still, and because of immigration. But the president of the Republic, all the top jobs in the country are still reserved for Maronite Christians. The president of the Republic is a Maronite Christian. The head of the army is a Maronite Christian. The head of the National Bank is a Maronite Christian. This is the way it has been since independence. This is the way it's going to be. So to paint the last 20 years of Lebanese history as a war against Lebanese Christians or a purging of Christians is an absurdity. It is not. There's a civil war. There's one other thing to be said. The Lebanese Christian community is not homogeneous at all. You have the Maronites, essentially a Catholic group, more or less. You've got various different kinds of Orthodox, like Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Antiochian, like that.
All right, now listen.
You've
wait a
got,
second.
you've got
I gotta catch
Armenians.
you. You're exactly right, but I got to catch up.
So there's no
with
unity there.
One of the things that's most important is that everyone would like to know, though, is what's the official position of Lebanon in regard to Israel at this point.
Okay, Israel is entirely surrounded by Arab states or entities that have either made peace with it or have offered to make peace with it on the same basis that the two which actually have treaties, Egypt and Jordan, did. Egypt and Jordan have peace treaties with Israel. The Palestinians have recognized Israel in 1993 in its internationally recognized borders and have been trying to make a deal based on the same principles that underlie the Egyptian and Jordanian peace treaties, which is Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories back to the borders of June 4th, 1967. They won't do it with regard to the Palestinians, which is why there's this war going on for the past 2 years in the occupied territories. Same goes for Syria. Syria has basically been saying, look, you have to withdraw, we want the same deal, and they've been saying this for about 20 years. We want the same deal that the Jordanians and the Egyptians
Did you misspeak
got.
when you said Syria rather than Lebanon? Or
No, I'm saying Syria, and I'm
Okay.
coming to, because I told you that already that Lebanon does not have an independent foreign policy.
I
It
see.
follows Syria's lead. So it's important for me to come to Syria first.
I'm glad you explained that.
Right. Syria is basically saying that if Israel withdraws from all of the Golan Heights, they would make a peace treaty with it. And that's basically the deal on the table. The Israelis will not. They want to keep a very small strip of land around the northern shore of Lake Tiberias because they don't want to share the water again.
Is that the high ground, that so-called high ground
No, it's
question?
not. No, the Golan Heights is all high ground, but the Israelis had agreed to give it all back. What they don't want to do is they don't want to share the water. The Golan Heights borders on Lake Tiberias, which is a large body of fresh water, which the Israelis call Kinneret. And what the Israelis are proposing and have been insisting on is that they keep a very small strip, even just a couple hundred meters or something, around the northern shore of Lake Tiberias, so the Syrians will not have access to that water. The Syrian position is, look, you got to withdraw from all the territories, just like you did with Jordan and Egypt. So anyway, the Syrian offer is basically that. The Israelis won't agree to that, just as they won't agree to withdraw from the Palestinian-occupied territories. They want much more than a few hundred meters there. But Lebanon has said it will follow Syria's lead. So this is my point. Israel is entirely surrounded by countries that have either made peace with it or have said they are ready to make peace with it if they would just withdraw from the occupied territories. And they're not willing to do it.
Let's jump back to today and right here at this conference, this Muslim conference.
Sure.
What do you think is the biggest danger to the Muslim society in the United States at this point in time, based on your opinion?
I mean, I think the immediate challenges are civil liberties challenges. Things like the detention of immigrants that we've been seeing here in Southern California was a very large group a few days ago, and as each day goes by, more and more people are being released. But it's still the case that immigrants from the Arab world and other Muslim countries are being treated very differently than other people, that we've actually reintroduced for the first time in many decades a system of overt discrimination on the basis of national origin in our immigration policies. This is alarming, and it targets specifically Muslims in the United States. I'm talking here about alien registration, about voluntary interviews.
Your opponents would say simply that 9/11 had contributed to this, that the effects of the Bali bombing contributed to this.
Of course.
That the effects of the Iraq situation contributed
Well, of course.
to this.
Well, obviously, you could always find a rationalization. People who believe in racial profiling point to crime statistics that they say show that African Americans are more likely to be engaged in violent crime than other groups, and that therefore it's okay.
Well, as a Lebanese and as someone who certainly would know, there's a thought in this country that there perhaps are not. I'm going to use the generic Al Qaeda cell thought process, but I don't mean just Al Qaeda. I'm saying a variety of Muslim and Arab cells within the United States that are a clear and present danger to our safety in this country. Do you believe that exists or not?
I don't know. I think that what interests me very much is that in the past few days, the general who is in charge of overall counterterrorism, and he's actually a member of the military, he's a military general, has said that he can't see any evidence that there are sleeper cells operating in the United States. Now, the Attorney General says so. He says there are. But he's got a political agenda about pushing through a bunch of legislation and defending a bunch of policies that are otherwise controversial. He might be right. I don't think he really knows, frankly, because I think if he did know, there'd be a lot of arrests. The arrests we've seen don't make that case at all. So the question is, are there any? If there are, how many are they? And then the bigger question is, do we need to shred the Constitution? Do we need to shred the Bill of Rights in order to go after it? We have law enforcement techniques in place. We've been dealing with the mafia, the militia movements, Soviet espionage, all kinds of serious national security and law enforcement problems for hundreds of years, for more than 200 years.
Well, the Patriotic, it wasn't just the Muslims that were impacted, it was virtually every person in this country has been impacted by the Patriot Act.
No, it's not the Patriot Act. I'm talking here about the you asked me what challenges is the Muslim community in the United States facing. I'm telling you it's discrimination in the field of immigration. That's nothing to do with the Patriot Act. Basically, the Patriot Act, only one aspect applies, which is indefinite detention based on no process, based on a certification from the Attorney General. What I'm telling you is there's a whole series of executive policy changes that have nothing to do with the Patriot Act, like alien registration, like voluntary interviews with thousands of young men,
the administration is profiling in depth.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I'm going to be very clear what I'm saying. I'm saying that the administration, by policy changes, executive unilateral policy changes on immigration, has reintroduced systematic national origin discrimination into our immigration system for the first time in decades.
And you think
That's
it's
a
not
fact.
founded? It's not well founded.
Well, I think that if we want to change from being a country that operates under the principle that of equality on the basis of national origin and non-discrimination based on ethnicity, national origin, religion, etc., and change to being a country that accepts the need to discriminate on the basis of national origin, religion, ethnicity, we've made a huge change, and we better be damn sure we want to do that. We better be sure that that is what we think is in our national interest, that that's the country we want to be, that we consider the threat that we face so serious that we're willing to abandon core American principles.
Mr. Amish, I got to ask you one question. I'll
Sure,
flip
go
it over
ahead.
to Larry.
Okay, that's fine.
But are you a citizen of the United States?
Certainly, I was born a citizen of the United States. I'm not an immigrant. One of my parents was already an American citizen when I was born in Lebanon. I have a State Department birth certificate for an American citizen born overseas. And I'm not only a citizen, I am in fact, although I was born outside the United States, I'm a natural born American.
Now, are you a Muslim?
I'm not a religious person. I come from a Muslim family, but and so in that sense, I am. But honestly, I'm not particularly interested in religion. And I certainly don't believe in religious politics, particularly of the fundamentalist variety, of whatever form. And we have virulent forms on display right now as we speak: Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and Hindu. All of them out of control. And I would like to, obliterate
Let's
this.
just stop.
I want to
You made enough
these
people mad
quotes.
like that one.
Zain, I'm just going to ask you two questions.
that's a
Author
fact.
of The Media and the New Intifada, is that correct?
Media and the New Intifada, which is in the book The New Intifada, which was published a year ago by Verso Press.
Can you tell our viewers, define Intifada for them?
Intifada is an Arabic word which means uprising. And in the case of the Palestinian National Movement, it's been applied popularly to two moments. The popular uprising that happened between 1987 and 1991, which was basically a spontaneous grassroots eruption on the ground that was in essence mainly nonviolent, some rock throwing, etc., but it was an unarmed uprising. It was met with overwhelming force by Israel. The process came to an end with the Madrid summit and the initiation of the peace process. Negotiations that Palestinians came to believe, were told, would lead eventually, sooner rather than later, and in fact, according to the treaty that they signed, the Oslo Treaty, within 5 years, to the establishment of a Palestinian state. After the Camp David summit took place in 2000, summer of 2000, and following a shooting incident involving Israeli border police opening fire on unarmed Palestinian protesters in Jerusalem following Ariel Sharon's visit to the holy mosques in Jerusalem, another uprising emerged, largely because Palestinians had given up on the idea that they would ever achieve their liberation through negotiations with that Israeli government. This Intifada is very different because of the presence of the Palestinian Authority, which is able to direct to some extent what's been going on, certainly to provide popular leadership, and also the heavy participation of extremist groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which had steered the thing not only in the direction of violence, but in the direction of terrorist violence in terms of the suicide bombing. And unfortunately, this Intifada, which looks much more like a war, is characterized mainly on both sides by Israeli and Palestinian groups murdering each other's civilians.
Let's follow that one up, because there's a big issue. Why hasn't the United Nations put a peacekeeping force into the West
That's an
Bank
easy question.
and straightened the whole thing
Yeah,
out?
it's a very easy question to answer. The reason the UN hasn't taken that action is because Israel opposes that because they wish to continue to build settlements and they wish to solidify their rule over most of that area, which they want to, at some point, when they can figure it out logistically and demographically, formalize and annex. The Israeli position is being supported by the world's hyperpower, by the only superpower, the United States. We, because of our essentially the array of domestic forces which demand uncritical, unconditional support for Israel, especially in its dealing with Palestinians, we've taken up the Israeli position. We won't let the UN even discuss this, even though it's the obvious first step to separate, to put in an international force to separate these people, to protect Palestinians from the Israeli army, and to protect Israelis from Palestinian extremists. I mean, this is an obvious step, and the only parties in the world that are against it are Israel and, because of that, the United States. It's also true, by the way, that every single party, including the U.S. government, is on record as saying the solution to this is the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, more or less in the 1967 borders. Every single party in the world is in favor of this. The Palestinians, the Arab League, the UN Security Council, the United States, the European Union, everybody's in favor of this except for one party, the Israeli government. The Israeli government is against it. They're the only ones who are against it.
Let me ask you another question. You know, we see the camps, we see the poverty.
Right.
With all of the 1.5 billion Muslims,
Yeah.
the wealth, even like Saudi Arabia,
Right.
why aren't Muslims taking care of other Muslims? Why aren't they helping you with food and
Well,
medical equipment? and
well,
things
they
that
have
need?
done, but they haven't done enough. I mean, you know, you're talking about a failure to live up to a responsibility that's palpable, that's undeniable. There's no point in denying it. There's no basis for denying it. A lot of Arabs have done a lot of Muslims have done a lot for Palestinians, but clearly not enough. The world community has done a lot. UNRWA has actually borne most of the burden. UNRWA is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which was created for and is charged with taking care of the Palestinian refugees. It was created shortly after the ethnic cleansing of about 750,000 Palestinians in 1948 war with the establishment of Israel. The world community, the UN, realized, I think, that they had a particular responsibility because by authorizing the partition of Palestine and basically encouraging the Israelis to engage in this kind of more or less takeover of Palestine, of which there were only a quarter of the population before the war began, that they had a particular responsibility, the world had a particular responsibility. So UNRWA has borne most of the burden. And, you know, I think that the failure of Arab societies and Muslim societies bespeaks problems with Arab and Muslim societies, but it does not do anything, as people who usually raise this issue hope that it would, to relieve Israel of the responsibility of having ethnically cleansed and dispossessed these people and prevented them from going back to their homes for 50 years. And it doesn't do anything also to lessen the claims of Palestinian refugees for their basic human rights.
I've got one last question for you. Should there be peace in the Middle East without state?
There is a fundamental requirement for peace, which is equality. Peoples cannot live together in roughly equal numbers, or in this case in equal numbers, in a country under conditions of total inequality. Right now, in this place, this country which is west of the Jordan River and east of the Mediterranean, which you could call it Palestine, you could call it Eretz Israel, you could call it Israel/Palestine, whatever you want to call it, there are exactly equal numbers, 4.7 million of two national groups. There are 4.7 million Jewish Israelis and 4.7 million Palestinian Muslims and Christians. They live in the same country. All the political power is in the hands of the Jewish Israelis, and the overwhelming majority of the Palestinian Muslims and Christians, 3.5 million out of 4.7 million of them, are not citizens. They're not citizens of the state that rules them or any other state. They're completely disenfranchised. They have no rights whatever. They live under the rule of a hostile and abusive foreign army, which is there to take their land away from them bit by bit on a daily basis and give it to settlers who've come illegally from Israel to colonize the place. And this is fundamentally the cause. Let me finish my thought. This is fundamentally the cause of the conflict. Now, it's axiomatic, I think, that you cannot have peace and reconciliation between masters and slaves. You cannot have between the dominant and the subjugated. This will not work. You will only have conflict.
For this,
Hold on, I'm not done yet.
Okay.
You know, in order to have peace and reconciliation, you've got to have a modicum of equality. There are two ways you can achieve this. One is through the creation of a Palestinian state in the occupied territories. This is the quickest and easiest way. And that provides equality, not in the sense that there'll be equal states, equally big or equally powerful, but that people can relate to each other as citizens of equally sovereign states. That's enough equality, in my opinion, to end the conflict. The other way is to have a democratic state for everyone who lives in it, in the whole place, right? That is fundamentally antithetical to Zionism, the notion that there has to be a Jewish state in the Middle East. And so Israel is unalterably opposed. I think it's much easier to get to peace and reconciliation through the first option, the Palestinian state, than it is to wage a confrontation with both Zionism and Palestinian nationalism in all their forms and create a single non-ethnic democratic state. I mean, that's a long, painful process. We should take advantage of the limited space that exists for the creation of Palestinian statehood as soon as possible, and it's in more than anyone else's interest, the interest of Israelis.
But who pays for it?
Well, I mean, I think it would be a combination of people. I think that the Arab world, with its resources, would be willing to chip in a lot. But I think that ultimately the international community and ultimately the United States would be called on to pay a great deal of money. We are already sending over $5 billion a year to Israel in direct foreign aid.
And they're not attacking they're not driving airplanes into our buildings.
Well,
They're
neither
not
are
attacking-
Palestinians. Neither are Palestinians.
I understand that, but my point being
Well,
is
look,
that
you-
you've got
right.
to look at, you still have terrorist bombings
Of
that
course,
are going on
of
in
course.
Israel.
Well, let's
More than just a few.
I agree, but let's be intelligent about this, shall we? You've got a group of terrorists, Al Qaeda, which has murdered a large number of Americans, and which is plotting and threatening to murder a large number of women. There must be a real, powerful, decisive war against this organization and its allies that has to be obliterated. We cannot tolerate such an organization to exist. Everyone agrees with this, and I certainly agree with it. Now, that means that you're going to have, obviously, a military front, as we saw in Afghanistan. You're going to have a law enforcement and policing front, as we see all over the world. You're going to have a financial front where you try to take away their money. But you have to have, more importantly than the others, you have to have a political attack on them. All right? Their strength, this underground political movement, this terrorist organization, Al Qaeda, their strength comes from legitimate issues and grievances, like the suffering of the Palestinians and the occupation, that they exploit in order to get recruits and to justify their behavior.
Over 60 countries have been identified by the Attorney General, sir, that say that Al Qaeda networks are within 60 different countries.
Right, exactly.
So how would you propose that any government attack 60 different underground types of organizations?
I'm trying to explain it. Try to follow me. What I'm saying is, if you can identify the issues that this organization benefits from politically and take it away from them, steal their weapons, steal their rhetoric, cut off their political oxygen, strangle them politically by solving the problems that they exploit to try to justify their evil deeds and try to win recruits. Number one thing that they keep referring back to again and again and again is the Palestinian issue, even though there are almost no Palestinians involved in Al Qaeda, even though there's no presence of Al Qaeda in the occupied territories, although the Israelis keep trying to manufacture one, as reported in the Israeli press. They're actually, the Shin Bet, the Israeli Secret Service, is trying to convince Palestinians to say there is one by appealing to them, but there isn't. That it makes a lot of sense to try to do your best to resolve this festering wound, this dangerous and destabilizing war, and this political windfall to a bunch of crooks.
2,500 years we haven't resolved it.
It's not 2,500 years at all. This conflict, that is only someone who doesn't know anything about the history of that conflict can say that. This conflict is not more than 100 or 120 at the outside years old. In fact, it really begins, and it would be very difficult to date it further back than this, in 1897, at the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, where a group of Jewish Europeans met in committee and decided to initiate a well-funded, highly organized program to colonize Palestine and to replace the locals with themselves. And that is the basis of the struggle. If you go back to say 1850 or before, even 1880 and before that, there is no Zionist movement. There is no Israeli national agenda. There is no conflict.
The covenant of the Hamas covenant doesn't want just to have Palestinians occupy their property.
Right.
They want every Israeli out of Israel. They want every infidel out of
Hamas, of course, and that's why an extremist group like Hamas needs to be again, kept in the fringe that it is. There's very good polling among Palestinians. It's probably the best in the Arab world because of the work of Khalil Shikaki, a pollster based in Ramallah, and other people. They do a lot of polling. And Hamas generally goes from between 12% to 20% support among Palestinians. The worse the situation is, the higher they go, the more support they get, but they've never cracked the 1 in 5. They've never really beaten the 20% mark. And they've been around for more than 20 years, and more than 25 years actually. And their parent organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, has been doing all this social services work for the last almost 50, 60, 70 years. So they've been trying hard. They can't crack that. So they are a fringe movement. They are a loud movement. They're a violent movement, but they're a fringe movement. And ultimately, a Palestinian state would have to do what all states do, which is move quickly to suppress extremist groups in order to maintain a monopoly on violence. Let me tell you something. The Israeli experience is a perfect example.
That's what I was about to say.
The Israeli
because Chairman Arafat said he couldn't control Hamas.
He can't until there's a state, right?
The Israelis to
That's
go
right.
in to
And in
Palestinian areas and
of course,
squelch the
of course,
challenge.
no national. I mean, it is a whether it's unfortunate or ineluctable, whatever you want to call it, it is a fact of history that national liberation movements or national movements do not and cannot take up the agenda of suppressing extremist groups working more or less in the same cause, even if they're causing harm. Hold on, let me finish my statement. That they do not do that. For example, the Indian state did not move against the Indian National Army, Subhash Chandra Bose, right-wing groups, or the RSS religious militias until after the consolidation of independence from Britain. The African National Congress in South Africa did not move against the PAC and other extremist groups until after the consolidation of the end of apartheid, not beforehand. With the Israeli example, before the creation of the Israeli state, there were 3 armed Jewish groups. The mainstream Haganah movement, which became the Israeli army, and 2 extremist terrorist organizations, a larger one, and by the way, you could make the analogy here that the Haganah, the army of the Jewish agency, is very much like the armed forces of the PA, the mainstream group, and two smaller organizations, a larger one, the Irgun led by Menachem Begin, which is, let me
you've got to
finish.
cut to the chase here because you've got to answer the question. Either you have Palestine and Chairman Arafat in charge, and he can control
I'm telling
them,
of course,
or he
but
can't.
what I'm trying to say is no organization that represents a national movement that is not a state yet, that does not control a state, can do that. You're asking something impossible. You're taking a quasi thing that has very limited powers in very limited areas and telling it to behave like a state, holding it to the responsibility of the state. The Israeli state, the Israeli state did not do
would tell
it.
you if Arafat can't take care of it, we've got
They
to.
will, of course, do it under conditions of a state. By the way, even under conditions of occupation, and they have security needs and they have to do all these things, right? But there is no rationalization there still for taking the position that we won't discuss, that we won't commit to ending the occupation, that we won't negotiate at the same time. Palestinians are not going to give up struggling for their liberation, but they're willing to talk at the same time. Israelis might have their own security agenda, but they have to talk at the same time. When they refuse to talk, it means they're not interested in a negotiated settlement. They want a military victory.
Hussein Yvesh, thank you so very much for joining us on The Cutting Edge.
Hey.
Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you.
Good questions.